Everybody, welcome back to Polymath. My name is Dan, and today I want to talk to you about Islamism. Now, Islamism is not the same thing as Islam. Islam is a religion. Islamism is a political ideology. Islamism is basically the belief that Islam should guide politics in society rather than just people's personal lives. So, Islamism is basically political Islam. Now, when we talk about Islamism, we need to be very sensitive about this because the topic of Islam and Islamism worldwide in geopolitics and both domestically with immigrant populations, it's a very controversial and touchy subject. And it's the kind of subject where huge numbers of people online, and both you might have met in person, are weighing in. And the reality is there's very little actual scientific information on this. So what I want to do in this episode is not just give you opinions, not just give you hot takes, not just give you some random run about what I think Islamism is, which is what 99.9% of people on the internet talking about Islamism are actually doing, but I want to present to you a political science expert consensus on Islamism. I want to tell you what Islamism is and the history of it and the sociology and the sociology of it from an academic perspective. What, based on actual scientific study, is this ideology? What do we know about it? What are the different forms? How can we analyze this in a political way? So when we talk about Islam or Islamism, the key thing to understand is that this is a massive umbrella term. Islamism, there's lots of different varieties of Islamism. It can be done in lots of different ways. The political Islam is a very vague statement. So the degree to which the tenets found in the Quran are implemented in the society, the way in which they're done so, the means by which this is done varies massively. And the meaning of the word has changed over time as well. So the first use of the word Islamism actually dates to 1697. But Islamism in the modern terms, so Islamism as political Islam, really hit the popular discourse after the Iranian Revolution. So after about 1978 to 79. So some questions that are often asked and that I really want to address here are, is Islam uniquely violent? And why is the Muslim world so undeveloped? So for example, when we look at the Middle East, the Middle East and North Africa is this geopolitical region stretching from about Morocco to about Iran. And it includes some wealthy Gulf states, but these wealthy Gulf states are wealthy because they've hit massive reserves of oil. Non-petro states, so states whose economies aren't based on oil, tend to be economically underdeveloped as well as being extremely conservative when on sociological studies. So for example, there's this really big study called the World Value Survey, which just goes to different countries and asks them lots of different questions about their socio-cultural views. And this cultural region of both Islamic societies and African societies, so in the Middle East, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, tend to be the most conservative societies whilst also being the most economically underdeveloped societies. Now that correlation does not mean causation. It doesn't mean that one is causing the other. However, that is still a correlation, and that's something that I want to explain to you without giving you some weird bias or rant or political partisanship, but just giving actual academic information. So the first thing to understand is that Islam is an Abrahamic faith. The Abrahamic faiths are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These are all just religions, worldviews, which are monotheistic and believe in a figure called Abraham in the long past. There's no need to get into the theology of this. It's just the fact that these Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, are fairly similar to each other compared to other worldwide religions such as Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism or Greek polytheism or whatever, Aztec polytheism, Egyptian polytheism, all these kind of things. As well as newer sort of modern religions that have cropped up in the past 200 or few centuries. So all these Abrahamic faiths come from huge amounts of time ago. So Judaism comes from millennia ago, Christianity comes from about 30 AD when Jesus died, Islam comes from around about 600 AD. So these reflect values that come from centuries ago. And it reflects values that crucially came before an ideology called liberalism. So what does all that mean? First of all, when I say the word liberalism, do not get that confused with what it means to be a liberal. So that modern slang word of a liberal, that's not the same thing as liberalism at all. So liberalism is this social and political philosophy, and it underpins all of Western political and moral discourse. It's a philosophy which was first articulated in its modern form in the 1700s in this movement in Western Europe called the Enlightenment, and it gradually became accepted, the sort of dominant ideology in the West in the 1800s, and it sort of spread to the rest of the world thereafter. So just to give you an idea of what this thing is, liberalism, the reason why things like slavery and feudalism no longer exist is because of this socio-political philosophy. And liberalism is this belief system that I talk about this a lot in episode 26, I believe, of Polymath. But just in short, liberalism is a sort of statement. It's a philosophy saying what the purpose of society is. Liberalism is a philosophy asking what is good and what should society be aiming for. And liberalism says that what is inherently good, so the purpose of a civilization, is to establish a society of a free and equal association of individuals. So in liberalism, ideas such as freedom, equality, and individualism are inherently good things. Now, different strands and varieties and flavors of liberalism disagree on the extent to which freedom and equality and individualism are needed. So, for example, in the West, for example, feudalism doesn't exist. People have equal civil and political rights. So people are politically equal in the West. They're not economically equal in the West, however. Some people are far wealthier than others. And different individuals, so different strands of thought, we're really reflecting left-right political debates in the West today, basically sort of centered around to what is freedom and what is equality and what extent is needed. But what everyone agrees on is that these are basically good things. Another really important thing with liberalism, this philosophy that comes from the 1700s, is that in liberalism, when we ask ourselves what is right, what should we be doing as a society, what policies are right and just, we base that on human reason. So we're saying to ourselves, so liberalism basically says, if we want to figure out for moral decision making, we need to consult human reason in order to figure out what is right. What we can't do is just appeal to authority or appeal to tradition or appeal to religion. All these liberalism explicitly rejects as sources of moral decision making. So for example, if you want to justify something, if you want to justify some moral policy, such as, I don't know, I mean, it could be really anything, such as teaching the Bible in schools or whatever, you can't base on the principle of, oh, our religion says that this is what we should be doing. Liberalism explicitly says for any policy, we need to think about how this affects other people and use our ability to reason, rather than just appealing to these other concepts. And some other key ideas in liberalism, and again, these are stuff we take completely for granted, but were just not standard at all for the vast majority of human history up until the 1700s. All people have basic rights. Having a right is an inherent thing for human beings. People should consent to be governed. Violence is not an inherently good thing, and to use violence and to use force, you have to justify it. And when we think of a utopia, an ideal society, you think of a society where everyone is happy, right? That's your version. The policies that you believe lead to a utopia are probably very different, but that's the basic premise of what you think of as a utopia. But for the vast majority of human history, a utopia is just a society where people conceive of as everyone being obedient. So utopias before the 1700s, if you ask some aristocrat in the Middle Ages what their utopia would be like, it would be a society in which the vast majority of people were obedient to state authorities and religion. It wasn't conceptualized in terms of happiness and suffering. It was conceptualized in terms of authority and obedience. I talk about this a lot more in episode 26 of Polymath. And if you want a really long explanation of this, you can listen to episode 9 of Polymath. The point is that all these Abrahamic faiths come before that. So it's not just that they represent old and outdated values. The values in Abrahamic faiths are wildly, almost incompatibly different to the values underpinning Western society today, because they reflect values that come before this philosophy of liberalism. They become before the 1700s, when this philosophy was first articulated in its modern form for the first time. So what this means that when you look at all these Abrahamic faiths from a modern perspective, there's a lot of stuff which really doesn't look good. So you read the Bible or you read the Quran, and there's huge references to slavery and upholding slavery and telling people what they can and can't do with slaves. There's lots of violence, there's lots of bloodshed, there's lots of wars, God-sanctioned genocides in fact. So in the Bible, actual genocide, so when both men, women and children are wiped out of certain peoples, such as the Hittites, the Midianites, the Canaanites, there's many others, are repeatedly commanded by God. It's a belief system where certain individuals, so for example women, are seen as inherently inferior to other individuals, for example men. So these Abrahamic holy texts repeatedly advocate female submission to men, and that women should be subordinate to men, they should listen to male authority, and that they shouldn't contradict or defy men. And essentially, it's just a very, very different belief system. There's lots of violence, there's lots of wanton use of authority by exalted figures. For example, King David kills about 10,000 people one time for no real reason. He also has several men killed in order to sleep with their wives. And again, that is presented as a bad thing. In fairness, God is not a fan of King David killing people to sleep with their wives. But the point is that the values, and also a really important point is that suffering and happiness are seen as justified in the name of God. So God and religion is what is the basis for moral decision making, for example, not reason. So when the Bible does not say that you should be getting your moral and political truths from what you deem to be right. It says you should be getting your moral and political truths from that holy book, from what God says. And the Abrahamic faiths have all that in common. So that includes the Quran. It's actually worth noting that for its time, Islam was actually quite progressive for women, and Islam, as to the Quran, is much better in terms of women's rights than the Bible is, for example. So the Quran, for example, in Islam, women are allowed to initiate divorces. So if women are in abusive relationships, they are allowed to leave them. Whereas in Christianity, divorce is strictly forbidden, and in Judaism, divorce is allowed, but only if it's initiated by the man. There's also a lot of emphasis on reason and commerce, and there's lots of... It's interesting because the Quran itself is divided into lots of different chapters, and they sort of have different tones and vibes. So some of the surahs of the Quran, or chapters of the Quran, which describe life events from 610 AD to 622 AD, these kind of surahs tend to be much more pacifistic and reason-based and commerce-based than the later surahs. So the surahs describing the period of time from 622 to 632 is when they talk about power and politics and war, and where they continually advocate for violence and holy war and the use of violence in the name of God. So it's worth knowing that Islam, in many respects, was better for women than its time than the Bible, and that all of these holy texts continually advocate violence. And the Quran does not describe genocides, God-sanctioned genocides, in the way that the Bible does. It's worth noticing that the word shibboleth, which you may or may not have heard of, it's a bit of a niche word, it's a bit of a zesty word. So that actually comes from the Bible, and it's because God's chosen people in the Bible were committing genocide, and the way that they determined between people of their own tribe and people of the other side was by getting them to say the word shibboleth, because the languages between the different tribes were different. And if citizens fleeing a battle were unable to pronounce this word shibboleth, they were killed on the site. They were killed on the spot. So all of these holy texts are quite violent. And it's also worth noting that the kind of the exaltation of reason and commerce, because Muhammad himself was a merchant, in the Quran isn't really found in the Bible. And the sort of rise of rationality and the scientific method and commerce are often ascribed as being exclusively Western things, when in reality they're not. However, it's still worth noting that while Islam is a bit more progressive than the Bible is, it still undoubtedly subordinates women to men, it still undoubtedly talks about violence a lot, and it still undoubtedly reflects values which are not compatible with modern post-liberalist ways of thinking that we now accept as normal. The interesting thing is that although the Bible contains lots of atrocities and God-sanctioned genocides, not only do most Christians not know about that at all, but if you ask most Christians about that, they would either outright deny it or they would describe it as awful. So for example, when you go up to fundamentalist Christians in the United States and you quote them verses from the Bible and you tell them they're from the Quran, they agree that they're awful, and then when you tell them they're from the Bible, they just sort of get this state of cognitive dissonance. They just don't really know how to react. And that's really, really interesting, because the point is, for example, if you're a Christian watching this and you're offended by me talking about the Bible and its description of violence, that's good. It's actually a good thing, because that proves a really, really important point. It proves the fact that you're not reading the Bible for its accounts of genocide and war crimes. The fact that people find that wrong, the fact that Jewish people as well, individuals who worship the Bible as a holy book, don't take it literally, and that the accounts of some things that are described in these holy books are now reviled by modern day Christians and Jews, is really, really important, because it means that the actual political and moral values of Christians in the West aren't coming from the Bible. They're coming from somewhere else, and it means that the Bible is being interpreted to fit those norms. Because if you look at the Bible and you look at it talking about genocide and you say, oh, that's wrong, you're disagreeing with the political and moral philosophy of the Bible. And that's really, really significant, because if you're disagreeing with it, it means that you're actually getting your political and moral philosophy elsewhere. And you're using the Bible as a legitimizing agent of that. So that's really, really important. And this is something that happened after the Enlightenment, which is what I talked about, this movement in Western Europe, where people first started advocating liberalism. And a really important part of liberalism is the separation of church and state. And although the Enlightenment in the 1700s was this sort of counterculture movement in Western Europe, it wasn't mainstream in society. Throughout the 1800s, it did become accepted in society, and the principle of separating church and state from separating religion and politics became widely accepted in the West in the 1800s, and is now standard in the Western world, with the slight exception of the southern United States, where there's still much more overlap between religion and politics. But if you look at I mentioned that World Values Survey earlier. The United States is notably quite a bit less progressive than other Western countries. And I imagine that if you split the United States into North and South, then if you looked at the Southern United States, I imagine that where they stand on how sort of progressive or conservative the ideals of most people in that society are, I imagine that would align more with non-Western societies than Western societies. There's reasons for that. We're not going to get into that in this episode. There's reasons why the North and the South of the USA are so culturally different, but that's not the point. The point is, in the modern West, it's generally accepted that religion and politics should be separate, and that dates to this movement in the 1700s called the Enlightenment. I could make many episodes on the Enlightenment. It's one of the most important things ever to happen to humanity because of this creation of this philosophy of liberalism, but we're not going to get into that now. The point is that after religion and politics became separate, what that means is if religion and politics are separate, it means that you don't get your politics from religion. You formulate political and societal values based on other things other than that religion. And religion can still play a role in that society, but it means that you then have to interpret that to fit a political narrative. A great example of this is with modern science. Many Christians are scientists, but they'll just not take the 7 days account of creation seriously. They'll say, for example, the 7 days of creation as described in the Bible are a metaphor for evolution. And that's a really great way to keep religion and science compatible. But that's actually a monumental thing, because for the vast majority of Christian history, people did take that literally. And the fact is now, that's being interpreted. The fact that the religious account is being interpreted to fit with a pre-existing set of scientific values is extremely important, because it means that the source of those scientific values isn't religion. That's very, very important. That's a really big thing that happened after the Enlightenment in Western Europe. People no longer took their political and moral values from the Bible. An example of this, by the way, is in the 1900s, women receiving civil rights, and much later, I think really in the first decade of the 21st century throughout the Western world, homosexual marriage being decriminalized. That is a direct contradiction of biblical teachings on the sinfulness of sodomy and the subordination of women to men. And that is a prime example of political values being not derived from the Bible, and instead the Bible being interpreted. So many people there are homosexual Christians, for example, and there are female Christians who don't believe in homophobia or sexism, and they will interpret the teaching of the Bible to fit with that ideology. That's really, really important. So that's the sort of value. That's a really, really important thing. In the Western world, there's a separation between religion and politics, and religion is interpreted to fit pre-existing political values. However, in the Middle East and North Africa, for example, in this region, in the Muslim world, for example, and when I say the Muslim world, I just mean this swathe of countries, which actually extends beyond the Middle East and North Africa. So Indonesia and Pakistan aren't in this geopolitical region of the Middle East and North Africa, but they're still Muslim countries. But in the Muslim world, that decoupling of religion and politics hasn't fully taken place yet. And that's reflected in the fact that in things like the World Values Survey, these are the most conservative countries in the world, because they're adhering in part to a political and moral value system that was elaborated centuries ago before liberalism. So that's really, really important, because if Abrahamic religion continues to be a source of political and moral guidance, that has really big manifestations on the direction of politics and the way that morality is conceived in society, for example. So a great example of this actually is if you poll people in the Middle East. So let me get an example of this, because I've got some statistics. Hold on. I was recently interviewed about women's rights in the Middle East. An interesting thing is that, for example, in Afghanistan, the percentage of women who believe that a husband is justified in beating his wife if she has either burned the food, left the house without telling him, neglected the kids, argued with him, or refused to have sex with him, 80% of women in Afghanistan believe a husband is justified in beating her wife in that situation. In Iraq, that statistic is 51%, and Yemen, that statistic is 49%. I'm going to give more examples of these kind of statistics, but the point is that that is reflective of a society in which social and cultural norms still come from an Abrahamic text, which explicitly mandate that women should be subjected to the authority of men, and therefore that the defiance of that authority is an immoral act and deserves punishment. So, unsurprisingly, domestic violence rates in the Arab world are significantly higher than the rest of the world, and 37% of women in the Arab world have been domestically abused. The point is, all of this stuff has really, really important consequences. So basically, an Abrahamic faith, so if you get, for example, an Abrahamic faith plus the effect of the Enlightenment and the liberalism is what we see in the Western world. So the equation for the Western world is Abrahamic faith plus Enlightenment, and we get this modern situation in the West where Christianity is religion is a sort of source of spiritual guidance and personal fulfillment, but it's not a source of political or moral values. However, the converse situation, as we see in something like the Islamic world, for example, is Abrahamic faith minus Enlightenment, and that gives you religion being involved as a justifier for politics and as something involved in morality. So, for example, in the Middle East, only 25% of countries criminalize domestic violence. So in only a quarter of the countries in the Middle East or North Africa region, from Morocco to Iran, in only a quarter of these countries is domestic abuse or domestic violence even a crime. That is a political policy which is reflective of an Abrahamic belief that women should be subject to the authority of men. So all of this has real manifestations for policy. So Islamism is when you take the Abrahamic faith of Islam minus, so you have the absence of any kind of enlightenment or liberalism, and as a result, that's sort of the result, Islamism. Now, what's really important to understand is that in the West, Islamophobia often isn't based on this kind of political calculation. Often, many Muslims in the West use Islam as a source of political and social, many Muslims in the West use Islam as a source of spiritual and personal guidance, rather than a source of politics or moral values. So that's completely compatible with Western values in terms of liberalism and the Enlightenment and all the other stuff which we mentioned earlier. However, Islamophobia in the West often isn't just directed towards people who take their political and moral values from an Abrahamic faith. It's generally directed at Muslims in general, which means that Islamophobia generally isn't based on any kind of logic or moral principles. Most of people who have some kind of dislike towards Muslims aren't doing so because they believe necessarily per se because they're annoyed at their values and how women and other minorities are treated. It's simply the sort of basic human instinct of disliking other individuals who are different. It's that basic idea of you have in the West, you have a society predominantly composed of white Christians, and you introduce non-white Muslims, and the cultural, ethnic, and linguistic differences between these groups lead to dislike between them, and discrimination and prejudicial views. Now, when I say that's a basic human tendency, I don't mean that all human beings are Islamophobic, but I do mean that a part of human psychology, and I talk about this a lot more in episode 24 of Polymath, is to categorize human beings as sort of us versus them, as an in-group versus an out-group. And you see this all the time in religion, in politics, in football teams, in nationality, in almost anything. And most of the time in the West, Islamophobia is a reflection of this psychological dynamic, rather than a recognition that when you apply Abrahamic faith to politics, that's not just Islam, it's also Judaism and Christianity. It's a reflection that ultimately those two belief systems are incompatible. So Islamism, for example, is difficult to square with the Western idea of secularism and female and male equality, and the idea of separating religion and politics, and the idea of appealing to reason rather than religious authority when making political and moral decisions, because Islamism as a political form of Islam is a political form of an Abrahamic faith that was formulated before liberalism, and therefore is not compatible with modern Western values that have come after liberalism. So the point is that Islamism and liberalism are incompatible. And that's not because of Islam specifically as a religion, that's just the fact that it's an Abrahamic faith. I'm going to talk about later in this episode how it's the same thing with other fundamentalist versions of Abrahamic faith. So fundamentalist Christianity, to give an example, it's the same kind of situation. So Islamism has lots of different forms, and these forms vary a lot, but all of these are essentially different to liberalism. I actually think I might make this a standalone episode on just the nature of Islam and whether Islam is sort of particularly violent or something like that. I think I might make this a standalone episode, actually, like one of these 20-minute episodes. But I'm also going to upload a full episode on Islam. So if you're watching this episode, this might be as a standalone episode for a week, or it might be as part of a larger episode. It's sort of similarly to what I did with episode 24 and 25. if you are watching this as a standalone episode, if I do decide to do this as a standalone episode or a standalone clip, thank you very much for listening, and I wish you a lovely day. Take care. Okay, so for the people who are watching the episode on Islamism, just to continue, another important thing to ask is that why is the Islamic world relatively underdeveloped? So when you compare the Christian West to the Muslim world, Christian Western countries tend to be much wealthier, much more developed. And in the Muslim countries, although you have the Gulf states, where HDI and GDP is generally higher due to the extreme amounts of natural wealth, not only were these countries much less developed before the discovery of oil, but in these states there's huge amounts of inequality, to the point where many people in countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE are still living in abject poverty, despite the fact that a narrow elite with access to that petrochemical wealth is living hugely opulent lives. Many of these Gulf states actually, for example the UAE and Qatar, actually utilize slavery by having migrant workers come over and confiscating their passports and detaining them and cramming them into dwellings where they're kind of forced 5 or 6 people into one room and essentially forcing them to work for starvation wages. So that really begs the question of what's the difference here? So we've noticed this tendency. So the Western countries, which tend to be more progressive, as we see on something like the World Value Survey, also tend to be more economically developed. Now, some political experts attribute this to the Enlightenment. They say that the Enlightenment is responsible for the West developing and so we have a world, not necessarily now with the rise of other latent superpowers like China and India, but certainly for the 1800s and for much of the 1900s, with the exception of the USSR, the world was dominated by the West rather than the Muslim world, despite the fact that for most of the Common Era, so from about 500 to 1700 AD or so, the Muslim world was far wealthier and more developed and more technologically and scientifically advanced than Europe. Europe was a backwater for about 1,000 years, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the discovery of the New World in 1492. Meanwhile, in the sort of period of like the 700s, 800s, 900s, there was the Islamic Golden Age, where the Muslim world, so sort of Middle East and North Africa, the Muslim countries, or in some instances the caliphates uniting this geopolitical region, made incredible advances in technology and science and philosophy, which Europe could only dream of. Even as late as 1700, the Indian subcontinent, which was mostly controlled by Muslim powers, had about 33% of the entire world's GDP. So a lot of experts say that the divergence here comes from the Enlightenment in the 1700s. And they say that as a result of the 1700s Enlightenment, this sort of changed the political and cultural landscape of the West and allowed it to sort of experiment with industrial technology and industrial capitalism and liberal democracy, and all of that led to the West becoming much more economically developed than the Muslim world as we see now. And this viewpoint does have some merit to it. I sort of explore this in a bit more detail in episode 7 of Polymath, which explores why Britain and the West industrialized first, but it's an incomplete explanation. So to say that Islam or Christianity is the reason why one region is more developed than the other is an incomplete explanation. So Max Weber, a really famous sociologist, classically attributed the supremacy of the West in the 1800s and its early industrialization with something called the Protestant work ethic, a sort of series of values in Protestantism emphasizing hard work, thrift, saving, and diligence, and sort of other values that he said were conducive to industrial capitalism. So the viewpoint that different cultures, different kind of cultural value systems contribute to economic development is probably valid. However, all this begs a really important question of why did the Enlightenment happen in the Western world and not the Islamic world? Why is it that this cultural movement, these cultural changes, happened in a region of the world which was a backwater for most of it, rather than a region of the world which was economically, scientifically, and militarily undoubtedly superior to the Christian Western world for centuries, for a millennium even? So the idea of the Enlightenment being this sort of origin of the disparity in development between the West and the Muslim world doesn't make sense, because the Enlightenment is not a first cause. There has to be an underlying reason why it happened in one place and not the other place. So there's a correlation there. Clearly there's a correlation between the Enlightenment and liberalism and economic development. And in fact, if you look at the World Value Survey, the more progressive countries tend to be the more economically developed countries. However, that correlation is not causation. It's not the case that enlightenment necessarily caused that economic development. What's probably much more likely is that there's a third underlying factor, which both was the reason for the West developing this new cultural phenomenon of liberalism. So states have been around since the 4th millennium BCE. No one had come up with this before. The ancient Greeks kind of embryonically came up with liberalism in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, but not really. Modern liberalism really comes from the Western world in the 1700s, in this movement called the Enlightenment. There's a reason why it happened there, why there was this anomaly in human social development occurred in the West. And that reason is probably caused by some third underlying factor that's also responsible for the precocious industrialization of the West and its economic dominance. Now, anthropologists like Jared Diamond would argue that ultimate first cause is geography. That for the way that Europe is geographically quite unique, and that's a small peninsula with not very agriculturally productive land, with no great rivers to sustain massive, powerful empires, and it's split up into lots of different peninsulae, so it's very difficult for one power to gain ascendancy. I talk about this argument a lot more in episode 4 of Polymath, which is why some countries are more developed than others, and episode 7 of why Britain and the West industrialized first. That's probably a much more accurate reason. The reason why the Muslim world is underdeveloped compared to the Christian world is not due to Islam. And it's worth noting, by the way, that Europe was extremely zealous. The Christian Western world was extremely zealous in applying Christianity and taking a fundamentalist view of Christianity for the vast majority of its history up until the 1700s. And it's worth noting, it's not a coincidence that as Europe stopped doing that, it began to industrialize and undergo massive economic development. The point is, it's not a causative relationship. There's an underlying factor which explains why is it that these two countries, both of which adhere to Abrahamic faiths, why one of these regions then decided to separate religion and state, and why one of these regions decided not to separate religion and state. So the first cause of that arguably is much, much deeper. And in fact, when you look at the Great Divergence, so the Great Divergence is this phenomenon in sociology, talking about how Western Europe, or rather the Western world, became so much more developed than the rest of the world. The Great Divergence has roots. It didn't begin, but its origins actually come from the 11th century AD. It's something called the Commercial Revolution, where various city-states, for example those in Italy, began to practice wild-scale commerce and model the function and the sort of structure of their societies based on the function of commerce rather than feudal agriculture. This is a whole other discussion for another time. The point is, when it comes to economic development, Islam is not the problem. It's other underlying factors. Before we talk about Islamism specifically, I just want to give some really, really key definitions. So all of this has been sort of a nice sociological discussion of the origins of the Enlightenment and how religion and politics that sort of relationship has changed in societies. Let's zoom in a little bit more to Islamism specifically. Let's talk about some key definitions, for example. So Islamism, political Islam, the application of Islam to politics and society. Fundamentalism is a literal interpretation of a holy text. Fundamentalism is not specific to the Abrahamic religions, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Those are the three Abrahamic religions. Well, three major Abrahamic religions. But we're going to be talking about fundamentalism in an Abrahamic context here. So fundamentalist Judaism and fundamentalist Christianity exist as well. They also lead to similar harms that fundamentalist Islam does. So for example, an example of fundamentalist Christianity is the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is often seen as a sort of, almost like a meme in society. It's almost like, oh, Jehovah's Witnesses knocking the door. This is a group of people who take the teachings of the Bible literally, with its implications on sexism and homophobia and things like that. They actually tell other people, so their sort of public relations team tell people that homosexuality is accepted there. It's not. It also displays lots of cult-like behavior. So for example, in Jehovah's Witness communities, leaders of the Jehovah's Witnesses limit the information that other Jehovah's Witnesses are able to access. So Jehovah's Witnesses don't have access to outside information on Jehovah's Witnesses. They're only given information that the actual community, the Jehovah's Witnesses religion, the church, wants them to have. Also, Jehovah's Witness leaders keep files, like personal files on all members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, psychological files, so talking about their vulnerabilities, their life stories, their biography, everything about them. And even if you leave Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't retract those files. And also, Jehovah's Witnesses also shows cult-like behavior of reverence towards leaders in the community, silencing of dissent against the leader's word or any kind of dissent, and also individuals who leave the Jehovah's Witnesses are shunned, which means that all their family and friends are forbidden to have any contact with them. And this is, so if you look at talks from ex-Jehovah's Witnesses online, they talk about this process of shunning and how their entire life, their entire social support network is ripped from them as punishment for no longer being a Jehovah's Witness. So fundamentalism, not specific to Islam. Terrorism, another key definition. Terrorism is a political strategy. It's a political and military strategy. Oh, I dropped the thing I was fiddling with. Never mind. Terrorism is a strategy of directing violence against non-combatants. By the way, non-combatants as defined by legal experts, which is common consensus, rather than the terrorist group itself, because terrorist groups will never define non-combatants or civilians as non-combatants. Terrorism is this strategy of directing violence against non-combatants to achieve political aims. This is not specific to Islamism. So Islamist terrorism is a wave of terrorism that we've seen in recent decades. However, terrorism has been employed by loads and loads of different groups, not even just religion groups, often secularist groups as well. For example, far-right groups, far-left groups, ethno-nationalist groups, secessionist groups. You have the ETA in the Basque Country, the IRA in Ireland, the Tamil Tigers, Hamas. You have, there's loads of examples. There's also the SLA in America for a little bit. There's lots of examples. The KKK is an example of a terrorist group, for example. Even though for political reasons it's not prescribed as such in the USA, this is not specific to Islamism or religion in general. Jihadism is specific in Islamism. Jihadism is a belief in Islamism that the violence is necessary and legitimate to establish Islamism. Not all Islamists are jihadists. Not all Islamists believe in the use of violence to achieve their aims. That's a subset of Islamism. Salafism, this is another key definition. Salafism is a hardline school of fundamentalist Islam. And it's a school of Islamism saying that Islam should encompass every aspect of life and that there should be one Muslim country, a caliphate, to rule over all Muslims. However, not all Salafists are jihadists. So some Salafists believe that Islamism should be established by peaceful means such as education, propaganda, activist work, charity work, etc. Some Salafists are jihadists. So there's lots of variation here. Wahhabism is a subset of Salafism which is specifically used by the Saudi Arabian monarchy to legitimize their policies and the rule of the Saudi Arabian monarchy. So those are just some key definitions. So let's just give an overview of Islamism now. The key thing to understand is that Islamism is a divided movement. There's no center. It's not a monolithic political ideology. There's variants of it. And there's lots of different strains of it. And different groups, so different Islamist groups, so different groups that call themselves Islamist, employ lots of different means depending on their situation. So some Islamist groups don't operate by violence at all, some do use violence. It's really on a spectrum. So Islamist groups range from peaceful protest to propaganda indoctrination, to direct action, so non-violent protesting such as destruction of property, to violent protest, to hostage taking, to terrorism, to massacring civilians deliberately. There's a huge range of means which Islamists employ. So some Islamist groups, such as for example the JIP party in Pakistan, work within the democratic process normally, but have launched coups in the past where they can. The point is that these different groups employ different means based on their situation. This is really just a normal aspect of human behavior as well, and human political behavior. Human beings and different groups of human beings behave differently depending on their circumstances and the opportunities available to them. So, for example, in strongly democratic countries, so in the Muslim world, the most democratic countries within the Muslim world, such as Turkey, will have political movements such as the Ennahda movement, which tend to remain within the democratic process. Contrasting, within areas of the Middle East with much more conflict, for example, Islamic State, they use violent means to achieve their goals because the socio-economic and political frameworks within which they operate are different. This is just a basic principle in human behavior in general. So, another thing, often organizations such as Hezbollah or Hamas will have ostensibly non-violent political wings and then a violent terrorist wing. So these same organizations will have different kind of wings which operate differently in order to achieve different aims and to bolster each other. When we look at Islamist groups, so groups which call themselves Islamist, will vary on three overarching dimensions. They'll vary on three axes. One of them is the religious affiliation of the Islamist group. Another is the political aims of that group. And the other is the political means of that group. So what do they want versus what are they going to do to get what they want. So all of these groups, so all Islamist groups, reject westernization. So they reject the philosophy of liberalism, they reject secularism, they reject the Western values. In practice, when they say Western values, they really mean liberalism and secularism. If you're just watching this as a clip and you're not sure what liberalism is, just watch episode 26 real quick, or just go back earlier in the episode. It's not the same as being like a liberal in modern Western parlance. All of these reject Western culture as well, in general, and they want Islamic law to be state law. So Islamists all want the law of Islam, religious law from the Quran and other holy texts, to be part of national political law. However, lots of variation. So let's look at religious affiliation first. Some Islamist groups are Sunni, some are Shia, some are Wahhabi. Technically, Wahhabism is a subset of Sunni Islam. So Islam has this religious divide of Sunni versus Shia Islam. Kind of like Catholic versus Protestant, it's the same kind of principle, even though it's obviously not the same. And these different kind of Islamist groups have different views and interpretations of Islam because different religious sects have different interpretations of the religion. So that's obviously going to manifest politically. Sunni Islamism is the most popular because Sunni Islam is the most popular in general, and its origins sort of trace back to the 8th century, but modern Islamism has kind of emerged in the form of Sunni Islamism from 1928 with this creation of the Muslim Brotherhood, this Islamist organization in Egypt. So the Muslim Brotherhood, it's this international political organism. It's this pan-Islamist political organization. It's got lots of offshoots, got lots of sort of related groups. Lots of these offshoots have lots of different views and they vary immensely. So these offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood include terrorist groups like Hamas or Al-Qaeda, but they also include moderate ones such as the Turkish Ennahda Party. Shia Islamism is mostly represented by Iran, so Iran's government is currently Shia Islamist, but it's also represented by Hezbollah. And finally, Wahhabism is the ideology of Saudi Arabia, and it's known for dogmatism, so this rigid fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. It's this form of Salafism, and it's known as its advocacy of the use of violence. So that's one axis of variation. Another axis of variation, Islam is variance by their political aims. So there's two kind of discrete categories here when we look at how Islamist groups vary by their aims. National Islamists and global Islamists. And in this kind of variation, there's a different scope of aims here. So national Islamists will have their claims, their sort of ambitions, their desires of this Islamist group will be focused on the concept of a nation. Especially in Kashmir, so Palestine, Lebanon, Chechnya, these Islamist groups will seek an Islamist nation state. Be it an independent nation state, for example, an independent Chechnya or independent Palestine, integration into another nation, for example, Kashmir, an independent Muslim Kashmir being integrated into Pakistan, or some kind of Islamization of the larger nation in which it's passed. For example, in Lebanon, Hezbollah want a total Islamization of the nation of Lebanon, rather than the current Lebanese political split between Christianity and Islam. So Hamas also wants to end Israel as a state. So Hamas's goal as a national Islamist group is not just to establish Palestine as a state, but to end Israel as a state. And this is important because often with national Islamist groups, religious conflict and nationalism become blended. So the desire for religious assertion and supremacy and the desire for national assertion and national supremacy and the destruction of national enemies are combined together. And this is a really important feature of Islamism which distinguishes it from other right-wing ideologies. So for example, some scholars refer to totalitarian, so very hardline Islamism, as a kind of clerical fascism. So an ideology which shares the totalitarianism and the right-wing sort of hyper-conservatism, hyper-authoritarianism, and that shares the psychological impetuses of, of fascism, but which does so with a sort of religious orientation to it. So some scholars call hardline far-right Islamism clerical fascism. But clerical fascism varies from normal fascism because clerical fascism, it involves nationality and religion. It's these two kind of principles which are combined in this singular identity. And I talk more about fascism in episode 30 of Polymath. So global Islamism is another kind of Islamist group, and it focuses on the global role of Islam. So global Islamist groups seek to restore Islamic glory in general. They seek to liberate all rightful Muslim land from non-Muslim occupants. And again, different global Islamist groups claim different bits of land as rightful Muslim land, rightful Islamist land. So examples of this, the Khomeinist movement in Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, So Al-Qaeda, for example, is a global Islamist movement which seeks to reassert the supremacy and the glory of Islam, which all global Islamist movements do. But Al-Qaeda wants to assert that supremacy through jihad. And this brings us back, so this sort of brings us to the third sort of axis of variation here within different Islamist groups. Political means. Different Islamist groups want to establish Islamism by different mechanisms. A really simple typology here is Islamist groups who want to establish Islamism by moderate or reformist means versus Islamist groups who want to establish it by extreme or violent means. So these former groups are involved in democratic processes and elections. For example, the PKS party in Indonesia. Interestingly, when you poll most Muslims around the world in Muslim countries, most Muslims want a religious democracy. They want democratic institutions to coexist with Islamist views. And there's some theological basis of this. Again, there's a lot of leeway to interpret religious texts. So you can really assert any kind of ideology. So there are Islamist feminists, and Islamist socialists who sort of find aspects of these holy texts to support their ideologies. Again, interpretation is a major part of Abrahamic faiths and how they work. But basically, the idea of Islamic democracy is sort of based on this idea of shura in the Quran, which is this idea of Muslims consulting with each other to decide affairs together. So again, the moderate reformist democratic approach to Islamism is a thing. Another tendency is a violent revolutionary approach. So extreme Islamists want to rid society of wrongs such as the world not corresponding to Islamic principles, this decline in the Muslim power generally in the world, so a decline in the geopolitical significance and power of Muslim countries. These extreme, so global Islamists who, for example, take violent views or violent political means, want to liberate Muslims in non-Muslim territory, such as Kashmir or Chechnya, and they want to destroy or overthrow anti-Islamic governments who are currently oppressing Muslims. For example, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is currently oppressing Uyghurs, a group of Muslims, by running them to concentration camps. And in these concentration camps, mass rape and mass torture such as waterboarding is used as a tool to psychologically destroy these Muslims and to break their identity as Muslims. That's a very simple typology of the sort of aims of Islamists. Remember, it's really a continuum ranging from stuff like democratic agitation to protest to direct action to violent action to terrorism to massacre of civilian populations. It's more complicated than that. There's actually another scholar called Morten Valbjørn identified 7 different typologies of the kind of different aims of Islamist groups. So it really does get more complicated than that. So another really nice quote about this is this scholar called Salman Saeed, who wrote in his book, Islam is a constellation of political projects that seek to position Islam in the center of any social order. So Islamism is compatible with lots of different, there's lots of different flavors of Islamism. There's different ideologies that are allied to Islamism, so different Islamist groups may be inspired by socialism or conservatism or monarchism or democracy, generally less so democracy. But the point is, Islamism is compatible with different viewpoints as well. So there's lots and lots of different kinds of it, for example. So, and then again, you also get stuff like if you go online and you Google Islamist liberalism and Islamist feminism and Islamist socialism, you will find these movements online, but it's not really what Islamism is. You wouldn't use Islamism in a political science sense to describe these movements, because what they're really trying to do is sort of interpret Islam and holy texts in a way that fits pre-existing principles. Like, you would never arrive at feminism or socialism just by reading the Quran alone. You'd only get that by previously being a feminist or being a socialist and then seeking to justify that and legitimize that through looking at the Bible. The Quran, my bad. On this series, when we sort of analyze political ideologies, we like to analyze ideologies in 3 different dimensions. A political, so power-based dimension or axis, an economic axis, and a socio-cultural axis. Basically, within ideologies tend to say stuff on 3 different aspects. Power and who gets it, and how widely power is distributed and what you can do with power. The economy and how it's run, and socio-cultural ideas. So stances on issues like the role of women in society, racial equality, homosexuality, but also deeper ethical values, such as what is right, what is wrong, what basic principles such as empathy or equality or authority or loyalty do we base the moral system of this ideology on? So ideologies tend to vary in these three different axes. So what we're going to do with Islamism is we're going to sort of discuss Islamism in light of these three different axes. We're going to talk about what does Islamism say about power, what does Islamism say about the economy, and what does Islamism say about social cultural values. So Islamism is also, when we do this, we're also going to be referencing, because Islamism has lots of different flavors. So we're going to be talking about Islamism not just in theory, but also in practice. What are Islamist countries actually like? Because unlike communism, so with communism, it's difficult to define communism in terms of, with communism, I talk about this a lot more in episode 14, defining communism by what communist states did in the 20th century is a bit difficult, because these states essentially took an ideology which mandated, which talked about doing the exact opposite, and then just did the exact opposite in the name of communism. So like North Korea, for example, calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, even though it's not democratic. So when it comes to defining something like communism by what communist states did in practice, that's a bit more controversial. But with Islamism, it's much easier to define Islamism by what these states are doing in practice, because you don't see this discrepancy. There's no direct contradiction between Islamist theory and Islamist practice in the same way. So it's illuminating to look at real life examples. So let's first look at, what does Islamism say about power? So in an Islamist society, who gets power? What legitimizes power? What can be done with it? The key thing to understand about Islamism is that it's based on political Islam. So Islamism basically says that God, not man, is entitled to rule the world. Political legitimacy doesn't come from democracy or the people, it comes from God. It comes from theological sources, which means that Islamism is generally aligned against democracy, because democracy comes from this socio-political philosophy of liberalism, the idea that people should have rights and should consent to be governed, and that all people are equal. This system of governance comes from this basic philosophy. But if you start from a different philosophy, if you start from the philosophy that actually people aren't equal, and people don't necessarily, people don't have inherent rights. The rights that people get come from God. People's moral status, but what makes you a good person comes from how much you obey God. The legitimizing authority behind morality is not human reason, but it is God. That leads to very different political consequences. So power doesn't come from the people, it comes from God. So Islamist countries tend to be very hostile and suppressive to any form of political opposition. And that makes sense from a theoretical perspective, because the Quran does not allow for political opposition to God. God is good. God is the only source of moral authority. So dissenting against Islamism is inherently immoral. There can be no toleration of that. Now in practice, you could have an Islamist country where lots of different parties with different interpretations of Islamism vie for power. So that is possible. In the Islamist countries which we tend to see nowadays, for example in the Gulf states, you don't see that. Any form of political opposition, even if Islamist is still strictly oppressed. But in theory, you could have a sort of Islamist pluralism, but you cannot have non-Islamist political parties. And also, Islamism as a philosophy is inherently authoritarian. So when we look at this axis on power and who gets power in a society, different societies and different ideologies vary on how libertarian versus authoritarian they are. I.e., how much does the government intervene in the lives of its people? And Islamism is inherently an authoritarian ideology, because the Quran contains lots of prescriptions on how to live out daily life. So in the West, for example, Western countries are quite libertarian in general, well, relative to other countries in the world, because generally laws in the West tell you what you can't do. You can't steal or murder. But in terms of what you can do, in terms of how you dress and how you act, and how you choose to, consume alcohol and have a good time, that's up to you. In liberalism, the idea of liberalism is to give as few restrictions on political behavior as possible. That's not the case in Islamism, because the Quran contains lots of prescriptions on how to behave in daily life. So, for example, the Quran contains lots of mandates on how to dress, how to consume alcohol, how women should be restricted, and how the movement and actions of women should be restricted in various circumstances, how belief in other gods or blaspheming against Allah can be punished. All of this is quite authoritarianism. There's much more rules, there's much more rigidity on how you have to behave. Just to summarize, Islamism mandates a strong government which has influence on people's personal lives. Different kinds of Islamism vary a lot into what extent they want the government and to what extent they want Islamic laws to sort of dominate people's personal lives. So fundamentalist Islam, such as Salafism, say that Islam should decide every aspect of someone's personal life. Islam should pervade everything in life. More moderate forms of Islamism argue that while Islam should inform politics and society and state law should be based on Islamic law, that rigidity shouldn't be as strict. But the point is, in Islamism, it still either way mandates a strong government who imposes Islamic law on the population. So, another thing to talk about. What does Islamism say about socio-cultural values? So when I talk about socio-cultural values, I mean in a society, different societies will range in being progressive to conservative on a spectrum, right? And on that spectrum, you'll see differing views on things like feminism or trans rights or abortion, divorce, euthanasia, things like that. Islamist societies are by definition highly conservative. And if you look at the World Value Survey, for example, all these societies are far more conservative than Western societies in terms of views on things like the role of religion in everyday life, of course, but also on family authority and how the father should have authority over the rest of the family, on things like divorce, which is strictly approved of, abortion, euthanasia, of course, feminism and legal equality of women to men. Also, usually on more subtle cultural things as well, such as stigma around rape. So in Muslim countries, for example, there's a massive stigma around being raped as a woman. So lots of rapes are unreported because to make it known that you have been raped is a form of social suicide. It's really, really heavily disproved of. And we've sort of talked a little bit about the social cultural values of Islam already, but just to mention things like Islamism tends to draw Islamism draws legitimacy from Iran, from Islam, for example, and from holy texts in Islam, but it selects a handful of ideas of Islam. Islamists tend to be conservative, so they tend to interpret the Quran conservatively, because there are sections in the Quran which sort of have quotes on people being equal. I think Islamic feminism is often based on some quotes in the Quran. I don't know why I keep saying Iran. And the Quran about female sort of virtue and the importance of women and the dignity of women. But again, the Quran is not a wholly homogeneous body of ideas. So in the Bible, for example, the Bible's lots of different books. They often contradict each other in different ways. So the Old Testament and the New Testament are extremely different in the social cultural values provided in them. There's this similar kind, not as to great an extent, but there's also a lot of discrepancy in the social cultural views of the Quran. And different movements will select different kind of bits from the Quran. Islamism generally represents bits that sort of emphasize the conservative side of it. So stuff that doesn't really necessarily holistically represent all of the Quran and what the Quran is saying. Generally, so in fact, as a rule of thumb, apart from minor exceptions like Islamic liberalism, Islamism tends to interpret the Quran in such a way that emphasizes its anti-liberalist, anti-feminist nature. Also, another thing, Islamist views on violence vary quite a lot, as we've also discussed. So some Islamists recourse to violence sometimes. There are non-violent Islamist groups, there are violent Islamist groups. Some Islamist groups say that violence is not necessarily a good thing. Other Islamist groups say that violence can be a good thing and talk about how the Quran legitimizes violence by describing it as a righteous tool for the pursuit of Islam and Islamist aims and Islamic power. Most kinds of Islamism don't view violence as inherently bad. Again, this is fascism and other anti-liberalist philosophies also have the same belief. So one of the reasons why Islamism has sometimes been referred to as clerical fascism in academic literature is based on this commonality. Because both of these philosophies reject liberalism, so they share commonalities, such as beliefs on the use of violence and power, and how the arbitrary use of violence and power aren't necessarily bad things. But again, there's lots of variations of Islamism and Islamist groups, and some Islamist groups will disagree with that. Unlike fascism, Islamism draws its legitimacy from both ideology and religion. So whereas fascist citizens are meant to feel a sense of political responsibility to their leader, Islamist citizens are meant to feel a due responsibility to their leader and to Allah. Another really sort of big commonality between Islamism and fascism, and again, Islamism varies a lot, they're not necessarily the same thing, but as anti-liberalist ideologies, they share these commonalities, is this idea of palingeneticism. So both Islamism and fascism utilize a palingenetic narrative, which is basically saying like, we used to be great, we used to have a great society, then stuff happened. For example, in fascism, democracy, human rights, and feminism happened, as well as a bunch of other stuff, and we're no longer great. and now we need to be restored to the greatness of our past society. So Islamism also utilizes a palingenetic narrative. It's oriented towards returning to the past and revitalizing the past. And again, Islamists vary in how they want to do this and how fundamentalist they want to be, but it's a commonality amongst Islamist groups. And of course, in terms of social issues such as gay rights, abortion, dress codes, public displays of affection, they are extremely conservative, more so than Western conservatives. In Qatar, for example, there was this example in, I don't know if it's Qatar, but it was one of the Gulf states. A British couple kissed in the back of a taxi, and they were immediately driven by the taxi driver to jail due to the public display of affection. Also, lots of foreign tourists, several foreign tourists who have been married and have gone to the Gulf states, have been raped and reported being raped, have been detained due to suspicion of the crime of extramarital sex, and have had to prove in a court of law, whilst having their passports confiscated so that they can't leave, that they were in fact not consenting to sex. They had to prove their own innocence in terms of extramarital sex. They were convicted for that as well. And in terms of the conservatism of different Islamist groups on social issues, especially with women, this has very real consequences. And I talk about this in the interview, but I just want to give some more examples, for example. So Tunisia is the only country in the Middle East and North Africa where women have full legal rights to men. So in other countries in this geographic region, stretching from Morocco to Iran, women do not have basic rights to travel without male permission, to leave their house without the permission of their father or their husband, to choose where to work, or to disobey male authority. So 15 countries in the Middle East or North Africa legally require women to either obey men, live with them, even if they're being violently abused, or to get their permission to leave home, to work, or to travel. In Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, women have been arrested or forced to return when fleeing from domestically abusive husbands. In Algeria, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kuwait, these are statistics which might be slightly outdated now, by the way, but they were the case until at least just 10 years ago. Women do not have the right to even own a passport without their guardian's permission. Only Morocco legally forbids any kind of gender discrimination in hiring, and only Algeria has ruled in favor for equal wages. In terms of sort of beliefs on feminism and male authority, in Palestine, just using that as an example, 60% of men and 50% of women strongly agreed that a violent husband is not solely responsible for his behavior because it is caused by his wife and the conditions of his daily life. 71% of Palestinian males and 64% of Palestinian women agree that husbands should have the right to beat their wives if they believe that she's unfaithful. And 80% of rural Egyptian women, the statistic is higher for men, said that husbands should be able to beat their wives if she refuses to sleep with him. Also, 99.3% of women in Egypt have been sexually harassed. 1 in 5 girls in the Middle East or North Africa region have been married before 18 years old. In Yemen, a third of all Yemeni brides are children. Rape victims are often charged with adultery or maybe detained in adultery throughout the Middle East and North Africa as well. Only a quarter of Middle East and North Africa countries have any criminal penalties for domestic abuse. Only 11% recognize marital rape as a crime. So a wife could be begging and pleading for her husband not to rape her, and that's not recognized as illegal in 88% of countries in the Middle East or North Africa. And only 5% recognize financial abuse as a crime. So the idea of restricting women's access to any kind of finance or independent ability to support herself. Again, this leaves women wildly vulnerable to abuse. And until 2017, Tunisian rapists would be pardoned for their crime if they married their victim. And this law actually comes from a phrase in Deuteronomy mandating the marrying of rape victims to their husbands, which has been the basis of law in many parts of the world until recently. And I believe Russia still has laws on that account. So Islamism, in terms of its conservatism, has real impact for the life of women and minorities. The final thing we're going to talk about is, what does Islamism say about the economy? So this is probably the fuzziest one here. It's probably the least clear tenet of Islamism, but Islamism does make comments about how to run the economy. So Islamists say lots of different things about how to run the economy, depending on the group of Islamists and the flavor of Islamism, but they do say something about it. The commonality amongst all Islamist groups is that Islamism argues for a regulated capitalism. So Islamism utilizes the economic system of capitalism, and we often associate capitalism with liberal democracy, but these are two separate phenomena co-occurring with each other. So fascist countries, for example, in the interwar years, were also capitalist. Capitalism is just an economic system, and I talk about this in episode 10, where the means of production are owned privately and operated for profit in a market economy. So that basically means the means of production is just the stuff that it's used to make things. So land, raw materials, factories, machines, they're owned privately by individuals or firms, and they're used by these individuals to make themselves richer, rather than meeting any kind of societal goal. So, and a market economy is one where the decisions on who gets what and what gets made are based on economic rules like supply and demand, rather than the commands of some kind of planning body, for example. So Islamist groups all advocate for some form of capitalism, but a regulated form of capitalism that's conducted in accordance with Islamic principles. So there's this forbidden of charging interest on loans. It's called riba, R-I-B-A, the charging of interest on loans. There's a sort of collection of taxes in Islamist economics which are sanctioned by Islamic law. So Islamic law mandates the collection of various taxes. One of them is zakat, which is a tax for charity, so it's given to charitable institutions. There's also in Islamism progressive taxation, which is basically when richer people in society are taxed more. Again, we take that for granted. For most of human history, the vast majority of human history, from about the 4th millennium BCE up until the 1800s, taxation was regressive. So more wealthy and privileged groups in society would be taxed less than poorer, less privileged groups in society. Another sort of aspect of Islamism is that the economic norms and attitudes of the Quran are applied, rather than, for example, the economic norms of modern Western neoliberalism. So the sort of attitudes to profit and accumulating wealth and the role of wealth in society and greed are different. And the idea is that in Islamism, greed is good. It's something that might be applied to Gordon Gekko and neoliberalist philosophies. I'm going to do an episode on neoliberalism later, but it's rejected by the sort of Islamic norms underpinning the capitalist economy. So the idea is in an Islamist economy, there's much more of an emphasis on equality and charity and thrift. So, another sort of thing is that often with Islamist economics, you get different sort of financial mechanisms, which are talked about. So in Islamist economics, you have financial mechanisms such as profit-sharing mechanisms based on Islamic texts, because different Islamic texts make comments about the economy and how stuff is meant to be run. Muhammad himself was a merchant, so there's lots of discussion of commerce and finance in the Quran. We don't need to get into the nitty-gritty details here, but basically, Islamic finance is this sort of body of financial economics, which basically says, okay, which financial mechanisms are sanctioned and described by the Quran. So there is a market economy, but the idea is in Islamist economics, you have a capitalist economy where the consumers are protected in some way. So they can't just be sold anything. Consumer rights are a important concern in Islamist economics, and it's ethical. Now, the degree of government regulation in Islamist economy varies a lot. Again, there's not a firm consensus in Islamism on how the economy should be run because there's lots of different Islamist groups. Mostly, Islamists advocate something called a mixed economy. There's more information on that in episode 11 of Polymath, but it's basically when the state owns some sections of the economy. So certain industries like energy or banking are owned by the state, and the state regulates the activities of other industries and companies. So examples of this, in Saudi Arabia, the government owns and controls the major industries such as oil, airlines, telecommunications, banking, infrastructure. In Iran, the government also owns large sections of the economy. So the Muslim Brotherhood, this kind of pan-Islamic organization, takes a little more of a free market approach. It's a little shifted to that side of the economic spectrum. And that it supports private ownership of these organizations. So rather than state ownerships of these certain industries, it supports private ownership. But with the state sort of protecting consumers and protecting the poor, regulating markets, and alleviating inequality and hardship. So the basic commonality is that in Islamism, the way the economy is meant to be run is as a sort of mixed economy, where you still have capitalism and you have a market economy, but there's government intervention in the economy, the state might own some industries, and there might be some degree of planning. So in some industries, in some contexts, the state may say, okay, this is what we want to make, and this is what we want to do with it. However, the general functioning of the economy is still made by market decisions. It's still made by private sort of consumers and sellers in a marketplace according to the laws of supply and demand. There's just this compatibility, this coexistence of market mechanisms and planning mechanisms. And again, many forms of capitalism have that. So for example, France in the immediate post-war years, fascist economics, for example. There's lots of other examples such as East Asian model of economics, so the sort of four tigers of East Asian countries, they often utilize this sort of dual system of market economy and economic planning. The Nordic model, another example of that. So again, there's lots of different varieties of capitalism which sort of advocate for different extents of government regulation. And Islamist economists is this sort of midway point between free market capitalism, like what we see in the USA at the moment, and it's the UK, a little bit less so, but particularly in the UK from like the 80s to 2008, that was a really dominant philosophy in the UK. And it's sort of in between that and more regulated, so very strongly regulated capitalist models, or in models of economics which don't utilize a market economy at all, such as centrally planned economies. So that's a bit of information on Islamist economics. Much more information on the different varieties of capitalism in episode 11. This actually concludes the episode on Islamism. So if you've watched all of that on Islamism, that really is a guide to Islamism. That's all I'm going to say at the moment. Thank you so much for listening. My voice is really hurting, but I'm very glad that I made this video. And I hope you're all doing very, very well. And I hope you all have a lovely day. Take care and goodbye.